Welcome to the Prosperous Empath podcast, designed especially for empaths and highly sensitive entrepreneurs just like you who are committed to achieving holistic success. I'm your host, Catherine Wood, Master Certified Coach, author, mastermind leader, and founder of Unbounded Potential, a boutique coaching firm for empathic entrepreneurs. I'm on a mission to bring empathy back into the world of business. Each episode will focus on achieving more by doing less through leveraging empath-friendly leadership practices, boundaries, rituals, and systems, all the while continuing to care deeply about ourselves, others, and the world around us. If you are committed to joyful living and running a conscious business, but amassing wealth while doing so, proving that you can have both in a society that tells you can't, then you are in the right place. Join me here each week to find out how. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review so you won't miss an episode. Plus, you'll find all the show notes and helpful resources over at unbounded-potential.com. Hello. Welcome back to the Prosperous Empath. Some context for today's episode. Last month, we released a mini series called The Prosperous Empath's Edge, and we released the first 2 episodes in a 3-part mini series all about the key strategies and tactics that distinguish between the empathpreneurs who succeed in business and the ones who don't. And it was such a joy recording those first 2 episodes because the lessons feel so familiar and relevant. They're ones that have been a deep part of my own journey over the past decade in business, and they're themes and topics that come up over and over again in conversations with clients. And in today's episode, we're going to round out the 3rd and final part of that mini series, and we're going to talk all about the key qualities that distinguish givers and takers in leadership, in business, and in life. And I want to be really clear about some context for today's conversation. I think it can be really easy to assume as an empath that to thrive as a giver is the right way or the best way to be in business. And that's not my intention for today's conversation, because as a giver myself, I think it's really important to keep in mind that there are such important lessons that we can learn from the takers in our lives and in who we partner with in business. And naturally, opposites attract. So as givers, we will tend to attract takers in our businesses, both in who we work with and who's attracted to partner with us and who we collaborate with and who we do business with. And that makes sense. It's natural. I mean, I am sure if you're tuning into this episode, you likely identify as an empath, and you may also identify as an introvert. And I can't tell you how many introverts I know in my own life who have their own best extroverted friend. And I just think that it's just an important reminder that yin and yang and opposites attract. And as givers, we need people to be open to receiving what we have to offer and what we so generously want to contribute and give to others. And as givers, we typically have a predisposition to resist receiving. That's often a mindset that we have to overcome, a breakthrough that we need to achieve along our journey. And takers don't often struggle in that area. They often have a predisposition to receive naturally and easily. So that's a key area where I think that as givers, we can all learn from the takers in our everyday lives. How can we observe what's being modeled for us and open ourselves up to receive in the way that takers so effortlessly and naturally do? So that's some context I really want to just be super clear about for my intention in sharing today's episode. I do not believe that givers do business the right way and takers do business in the wrong way. I think that both givers and takers, that we all have both positive and limiting aspects of how we operate in business. And as we become more self-aware, not only of our own tendencies and our own default habits and ways of engaging in business, but also what to look out for in the people that we typically tend to attract in business and in relationships, we can set ourselves up for creating mutually beneficial relationships. So I really do believe that in further distinguishing the qualities of ourselves as givers and the takers in our everyday lives, that this can be super fundamental to the success and the resilience of empathpreneurs. And it can also support us in understanding the motivations and the impact of each reciprocity style as a giver and as a taker, while also preventing burnout and helping us to manage and optimize our energy and time and boundaries, which are some of the themes that we talked about in the prior two episodes in this mini-series. Finally, as empathpreneurs, I think some themes that we commonly experience in our business relationships are themes of resentment, resignation, and feeling super attached. And as we become more aware of our own tendencies as givers, we can naturally protect them and take care of ourselves more so that we show up more fully resourced in our relationships. But it can also prevent some of these tendencies and predispositions to feel resentful, resigned, and super attached. And overcoming these tendencies are just so fundamental in really thriving and in achieving that experience of success as an empathpreneur. With that, let's jump into today's conversation. And I want to start with what success looks like for a prosperous giver versus what success tends to look like for a taker. So for a prosperous giver, success looks like an empath who's practiced in receiving help from others while maintaining a willingness to pay it back and pay it forward. So typically, when a giver wins, everyone wins, and it can create this cascading or this domino effect. And other people typically want givers to succeed and they root for our success because it can create this ripple effect where it enhances the success and the joy of others. Whereas a taker's success often doesn't feel like everyone's winning. A taker's success often feels like just the taker is winning. A taker is often solely focused for their own gain. They're much more self-reflective, self-focused. And when a taker wins, it can oftentimes feel like someone else is losing, whether that's true or not. So folks typically tend to envy successful takers, whereas folks typically celebrate successful givers. I think that's really important. The second distinction between the qualities of givers and takers is in where our motivation lies. So as givers, we tend to be other and us focused. We're also more likely to use first person plural pronouns like us and we. We have a conversation that's larger than just our own success, which I think makes a lot of sense because we're motivated by helping others, by being of service, by being a contribution. So we have this habit of putting ourselves in other people's shoes and in understanding other people's perspective, which I think is really beautiful. But takers, on the other hand, they tend to be self-focused. So they're more likely to use first-person singular pronouns like I, me, mine, my, and myself. And they're often overly focused on their own perspective, and simultaneously, they can find it difficult to discern how other people are reacting to their perspective and their ideas. Now, I think that this is really helpful because this is a really practical way to further deepen our own self-awareness around the givers and the takers that we already have in our everyday lives. And that's simply by listening to the language that they use. Are we more focused in a I and me conversation, or are we more focused in a us and we conversation? And oftentimes, givers and takers can learn a lot from one another by expanding their own tendency and their own default. So for me as a giver, oftentimes it can be really supportive for me to look through the lens of I and me first. It's not necessarily going to motivate my actions and dictate my intentions or my goals, but it is a really discerning place for me to start, to just look at, what's in this for me? What am I committed to? And then I can have a greater conversation with myself and with others around what's the overall focus, what's in it for all of us. So, this next distinguisher, I think, is one of the reasons why so many coaches tend to be givers. And that's because as givers, we're inclined to see the potential in everyone else because we have this predisposition to be trusting and optimistic about other people's intentions. Takers tend to place less trust in other people as they often assume that others are takers like themselves. And this can result in takers holding relatively lower expectations for the potential of their peers and their subordinates. Now, I think this is really important because we know that as we trust and extend our trust to and with others, that others naturally tend to be more trusting and more trustworthy. But if we tend to have lower expectations or harbor doubt or look for competition or reasons to question other people's intentions, we naturally attract those types of people to partner and collaborate with. So I think this is one of the reasons why givers make really effective leaders and really effective coaches, because as leaders, we tend to see the natural potential in our employees, in our colleagues, and as coaches in our clients. And we also tend to call forth that potential and hold our clients and our colleagues and our employees to that potential, whereas takers might have a little more work to do around extending their capacity to trust, expanding their capacity to see the best in the people that they work with and in the teammates they collaborate with and in the employees that they hire. This next one is a quality that I really appreciate about myself. And it's also something that I have to be really responsible for and protect. And it's this idea that as givers, we are naturally receptive to the expertise of other people, even if it challenges our own beliefs or even if it challenges our own knowledge. So we are just naturally more open to being enrolled in other people's expertise, in other people's knowledge, in other people's mastery. And I think one of the consequences for this, for me, is that because I'm so naturally receptive to other people's expertise, it can oftentimes make me more receptive to other people's knowledge at the expense of my own. So this is something I've really had to just just become responsible for, that this is a tendency I have. It's something that I really appreciate. And just because someone else's expertise is louder or communicated in a more dominant style, which takers often do communicate in more dominant styles, that doesn't mean that anyone else's expertise or knowledge is more valuable than my own. Takers, on the other hand, often strive to be the smartest in the room, so they are less inclined to consider or be receptive to the expertise of others. And this can also be discerned in our communication styles. As givers, we tend to favor what Adam Grant calls a powerless communication style, where we're more inclined to express vulnerability, ask questions, talk in a style that's more tentative, more advice seeking. And this can work for givers, but it can only work from a really authentic and transparent place. I think sometimes we can employ a powerless communication style as takers because we know that it's effective. But if it doesn't feel authentic, then oftentimes we can tend to sense that inauthenticity. So it's really important that, as both for givers and takers, if you're going to employ a powerless communication style to build rapport, to deepen relationship, that you use an approach that's super authentic and transparent rather than something that you know to work. Whereas, like I mentioned before, takers naturally have a dominant communication style and tend to just naturally employ more control, more power, more authority in how they communicate. Now, here's another distinction that I think is super interesting. Givers are more willing to express vulnerability in their communication. And this is something I think that we naturally know. And, we do this because we're genuinely interested in being of service and in helping others. We're not trying to gain or assert power over other people. And one of the challenges of being more naturally inclined to be vulnerable is, how do we express that vulnerability in a way that is relatable and human and approachable without it being seen as a weakness? And one of the key ways that givers can really thrive and succeed is when that vulnerability is communicated once a giver has already established competence. So once a giver has already established their own authority or area of expertise or competence, or created trust or mutual respect with their peers or the people that they lead, then that vulnerability is communicated from a place of deepening relationship and deepening connection, and also creating a deeper level of trust and rapport in the relationship. But if a giver leads with their own vulnerability before having established that authority, it can truly be seen as a weakness. And I think that this is really important, an important differentiator between the givers who succeed and the givers who don't, because I've certainly fallen into this trap. And I think it is important that we do need to toot our own horn from time to time, that we do need to just share our expertise and our credentials and establish that authority before really just falling on our own natural tendencies to be vulnerable and be open. And this is a really important one, because as givers, it really is a fine line between revealing our vulnerability and the beautiful heart-centered aspects of our personalities, but doing so once we've already established competence. Once we've already established rapport with our followers, with our colleagues, and with the people that we partner with. Now, takers have this predisposition to worry that revealing their weaknesses or that expressing vulnerability will compromise their own authority and dominance. So takers are consistently more unwilling or less inclined to be vulnerable. So I think that there's just a beautiful synchronicity there between how givers and takers can learn from one another, whereas givers can learn perhaps to be a little less vulnerable until they have established that authority. And takers can learn how to be a bit more vulnerable and more open. Here's another helpful distinction between givers and takers. Givers have a natural predisposition to seek advice, to ask questions, to open themselves up to receive support, collaboration, resource sharing. And this is a very helpful way for givers to exercise influence and build authority when they lack that authority. It encourages greater cooperation, and it can oftentimes result in creating win-wins in business and in negotiations. Whereas takers have a predisposition of ingratiating themselves to superiors or pressuring subordinates inside of their negotiation styles. So this can oftentimes result in win-loses in negotiation simply because their voices are the louder ones in the room. And I think this is also a really important distinction between givers and takers and how we can learn from the other negotiation style. The next distinction is also one that I picked up from Adam Grant's book, Give and Take. And it's how he distinguishes between the givers who succeed and the ones who don't. And he calls the givers who succeed other-ish givers, and the ones who don't, selfless givers. And here's how he defines them. Other-ish givers are those of us who care about benefiting others, who are super committed to being of service, but we're also responsible for and to our own ambitious goals. So we're not operating blind to our own motivations or our own intentions. We're generous and we're supportive and following our own inclination to give, but also while keeping our own goals and our own ambitions in mind. Whereas the selfless givers, who are the ones who don't succeed, who tend to not succeed, selfless givers are self-sacrificing. Those are the givers who give and give and give and care about others while being at the expense of themselves and their own goals. Now, I'm sure if you're tuning into this podcast, you probably can identify with being an other-ish giver and with being a selfless giver. And I think that this is a mindset shift that we all need to make on the journey to becoming a prosperous empath. And it's truly shifting from being a selfless giver to becoming an other-ish giver, to becoming the version of ourselves that gives open-heartedly, that contributes from a fully resourced place, while also being fully responsible for our own intentions, our own goals, and our own ambitions. And that does not mean that we're selfish, because oftentimes our own ambitions and our own goals are mission-oriented and they are impact aligned. So they are greater than ourselves. But it does start with us becoming responsible for them and really being willing to own what they are, to own what our goals are. And I think that for me, this has been something that has been just really supportive on my own journey in business, that I get to fully communicate what my goals are. Like I get to become authentic around what I want and what I'm committed to and what success looks like for me. Because in doing so, it creates those win-wins. It creates those negotiations we were talking about earlier that result in those mutually reciprocal outcomes, which is, I know, something we're super committed to here. Here's the rub. I think most empaths, most givers would benefit from becoming just a tad more selfish in their own lives and in their own businesses. And I think that takers would benefit from becoming a bit more other focused. So I don't think it's wrong or bad to be selfish. And I think that many givers have a really negative relationship to that word. And they really have this kind of knee-jerk reaction to feel like we don't get to be selfish or that's wrong or bad. And I really want to invite you, if you find yourself falling into that category, to really look at like what's actually in it for you to become a little more selfish. Like, how could you being selfish and being a bit more motivated by your own ambitions actually create a win-win? And it may even start with just really looking through the lens of what does healthy selfishness look like to you? Because I think that's really helped me transform my own relationship to that word, to that term over the years, which I think is which is one that empaths and givers struggle with inherently. All right, and there's two more distinctions between givers and takers that I want to cover in this episode. So the next one is one that I'm chuckling about because I can safely say I've had this conversation with every single one of my private clients over the years. And it's just this idea that as givers, we tend to be more susceptible to the doormat effect. We tend to be taken advantage of and treated like a doormat. And open ourselves up to being treated like a doormat, right? Like, this is not something that just happens to us. This is something that we welcome, that we make ourselves available for. And here's why. It's because we tend to assume that everyone's trustworthy. And it's because we tend to see the best in everyone. And because we have this pre-inclination to assume everyone is worthy and deserving of our trust, we tend to be taken advantage of. Takers are less susceptible naturally to the doormat effect because takers tend to assume that others are like them. So how can we overcome this? How can we become less susceptible to the doormat effect? And this is actually the final takeaway that I want to leave you with today. And it's this insight that in reality, as givers, we actually tend to be more accurate judges of other people. We have this instinctive advantage in relationship in that we can sense the intentions of the people that we're in relationship with. So we can actually become less susceptible to the doormat effect by trusting more deeply our own inherent nature as screeners of other people's intentions and objectives with us. Now, here's the rub. In order for givers to trust their own innate ability to sincerity screen, it oftentimes results in, here's the rub. In order for successful givers to trust their own inherent gifts as being accurate judges of other people and of other people's intentions, it oftentimes results in us being taken advantage of first. It's oftentimes a learned lesson when we need to put up our guard and when we need to adjust our behaviors or our generosity through prior or learned experience. So I think that this is just a really, just an important thing to know about, that not if, but when we are treated like a doormat or when our natural guard goes up, or we inherently sense that there's a reason to question someone else's objectives or someone else's intentions in partnering or collaborating with us, that there's probably a reason why. This is a really effective and learned practice in how we can trust our own intuition more. And it might even start with just getting curious about that natural response or that natural reaction of when you've felt like this before, or of when your own internal sense of protectiveness or desire to withdraw or even to put up your guard, and what that intuitive or felt sense might be trying to tell you. This may actually be part of your own gift to sincerity screen, and something that you can trust through practice and through a willingness to tune in. Takers, on the other hand, tend to be much less accurate judges of other people because naturally they're less attuned. They're less naturally gifted at sensing other people and sensing other people's intentions. I hope that you've enjoyed today's conversation. I think this one is just filled with so many helpful nuggets and important reminders about how givers and takers can both learn more deeply about themselves and learn from one another. If you found today's episode helpful, come and join us in our private community over at unboundedmastermind.com and let us know what your favorite takeaway was from today's episode. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much for listening today to this episode of the Prosperous Empath podcast with me, Catherine Wood. Make sure you subscribe and leave a review so you don't miss an episode, and so more empaths just like you and me can find the show. As a thank you, each month, one lucky reviewer will receive a 60-minute coaching session with a member of our Unbounded Potential team. You can find all the show notes and bonus resources over at unbounded-potential.com. Thank you so much for listening and locking arms with me to bring empathy and prosperity back into the world of business.